15. For centuries, the story of Roanoke drifted through American history like a whisper behind closed doors. In 1587, over 100 settlers arrived on the shores of an island off North Carolina. Then they disappeared. No conflict, no mass panic, just an empty colony and a single word carved into a post: Croatone. It puzzled historians for generations. Theories came and went. Some said they were taken, others believed they starved or scattered. What confused many wasn't just their absence, but the calm it left behind. There were no signs of destruction, no clear struggle. It looked like they walked away, peacefully, into the trees. But why and where? Archaeologists eventually discovered pottery and tools far south of the original site, on Hatteras Island. These items match the time and culture of the lost settlers. For the first time, there was more than speculation. There was physical evidence, and it suggested something unexpected, that the colonists might have chosen to live with local tribes. Further studies revealed shared DNA markers in certain tribal communities, reinforcing the idea that these settlers didn't vanish. They adapted. They may have even thrived. The screams once imagined by storytellers were just echoes of fear, not memory. It wasn't an ending. It was a change, one forgotten by those who never looked beyond the ruins. Number 14. In 1518, the streets of Strasbourg saw something no one could explain. A woman stepped into the open and began to dance. There was no music, no celebration, just movement. She kept going for hours, then for days, and she wasn't alone. Within a week, dozens had joined her, their bodies swaying through exhaustion. No one knew why they danced or how to stop them. Doctors at the time blamed it on hot blood or spiritual imbalance. Clergy spoke of curses and divine punishment, but all of them stood by and watched as more and more people joined the strange rhythm. Some collapsed, some couldn't walk again. It looked like something beyond reason had taken hold. For years it was treated as a bizarre story, almost a legend. That was until researchers revisited the records with a fresh lens. Historians and scientists began to piece together what the people of Strasbourg had faced. Not magic, not possession, but a mix of social pressure, fear, and something called mass psychogenic illness. A reaction to stress, grief, and shared trauma. The entire city had been stretched thin by famine and anxiety. Their minds had no space left for silence. The dancing wasn't joy. It was panic finding motion. The body moving because the mind no longer knew how to rest. It was a mystery once soaked in myth. But the truth, uncovered slowly through documents and modern understanding, was human. Not less haunting, but grounded in something real, something fragile. Something that still echoes when too many people face too much for too long. Number 13. For years, the Winchester Mystery House stood as one of the strangest homes ever built. Staircases led to ceilings, doors opened into brick, hallways twisted for no reason. It wasn't a design, it was a maze. And the woman behind it, Sarah Winchester, refused to stop building. People said she was haunted, that voices followed her, that the house had to grow because something was chasing her. These whispers grew louder than the hammering of her workers. She rarely explained herself. Those who visited often left confused, not just by the strange layout, but by the weight the place carried. The story many believed was that Sarah, heir to the Winchester rifle fortune, built the home to escape the spirits of those lost to her family's invention. It was a tale that lingered for over a century, one that turned the house into a symbol of guilt wrapped in wood and glass. But new research pulled that idea apart. Scholars found no strong evidence that Sarah followed spiritual advice. In fact, her letters hinted at something more practical. She was grieving, deeply. Her child had passed, her husband followed, and she threw herself into her home not to ward off spirits, but to hold off despair. What looked like madness became something closer to healing. She used architecture the way others use a journal. The strange design wasn't a response to curses. It was the pattern of someone building a world they could still control. The walls whispered, yes, but they didn't speak of ghosts. They told a story of someone trying to shape silence into safety. Number 12. High in the Indian Himalayas, there's a remote glacial lake called Rupkund. For decades, it held a secret beneath its frozen surface. When the ice melted in summer, bones emerged, hundreds of them, human skeletons scattered across the shoreline. No graves, no tools, just bones. At first, no one agreed on where they came from. Theories ranged from ancient battles to tragic pilgrimages. Some said a royal expedition had been caught in a storm. Others believed it was a forgotten migration, lost in the snow. But for years the mystery deepened as new remains were found each season. Then came the testing. DNA pulled from the bones revealed they didn't all come from the same place or time. Some belonged to a group with roots in South Asia, but others traced back to the Eastern Mediterranean. The surprise wasn't just how far they'd come, but how they died. The skeletons showed signs of sudden blunt trauma, but not from weapons or conflict. The damage matched a single type of blow, round and forceful. As strange as it sounded, the best explanation became clear. A hailstorm, one so violent it caught them in the open. No shelter, no warning, just sky turned against them. It sounded like myth, yet everything pointed to it being true. A natural event, frozen in time, misread for generations. What once felt like a battlefield or burial site turned out to be the footprint of a single moment. One brutal storm, caught in the cold, leaving behind a mystery only science could thaw. Number 11. In a Danish bog, a face stared up from the peat. Calm, eyes shut, lips drawn gently together. He looked asleep, but this wasn't a recent discovery. The Tolland man had been resting there for over 2,000 years. His preservation was so complete that many mistook him for modern, yet he belonged to the Iron Age. For a long time, the question wasn't just who he was, but why he was there. A noose still rested around his neck. His body was placed carefully, not discarded. The mystery wasn't in the finding, it was in the purpose. Historians wondered if he had been punished, perhaps by his own community. Others believed he had been chosen, not as a victim, but as an offering. And so the theories shifted back and forth. Archaeologists read the landscape like a puzzle. His last meal was simple, barley and seeds, no meat. That suggested ritual, not routine. Then something remarkable happened. By analyzing the contents of his stomach, scientists were able to reconstruct not only what he ate, but when he ate it. Just before he was placed in the bog, he had fasted, not due to hunger, but by choice. It lined up with ceremonial practices of the time. And so the story changed. He wasn't a prisoner. He may have been part of a ritual long forgotten. His calm expression, once seen as eerie, became something else entirely. A final moment of peace. The peat preserved more than a body. It preserved a farewell, one shaped by belief, not fear. Number 10. In ancient times, knowledge lived in one place, above all others, the Library of Alexandria. Said to hold thousands of scrolls from across the world, it became a symbol of wisdom and ambition. Its shelves were filled with texts on astronomy, medicine, mathematics, and more. For centuries, it stood as a promise that nothing would be forgotten. But one day, it vanished, not brick by brick, but thought by thought. Fires were blamed, wars, politics, and even careless storage. But no single event fully explained why the greatest collection of human knowledge disappeared so completely. It was easier to believe it burned, that someone had set the shelves alight. New studies, though, tell a quieter story. The library's loss wasn't one night of flames, it was a slow collapse. As leadership changed and priorities shifted, fewer scholars arrived, fewer scrolls were copied, some were removed, others were simply left to rot. Decay did what destruction could not. The idea that one fire stole the world's wisdom became more myth than fact. The truth was more human. The library wasn't taken, it was neglected. And that's what made it so haunting. Not the loss, but the silence that followed. No alarms, no headlines, just dust. The story became a reminder that knowledge fades, not always from force, but from forgetting. Number 9. The Tower of London has long stood as a place of power and shadow. Behind its stone walls, stories have passed through generations. Some recorded, others only whispered. People spoke of strange chambers, forgotten prisoners, and doors that led nowhere. Among those rumors, one stood out, a room that was never listed on maps, no official record, just a hint passed between guards and historians. For years, the idea seemed like legend, something told to tourists and dismissed by scholars. But then, during restoration work, a sealed archway was uncovered. Behind it lay a chamber untouched by time, small, dark and empty, except for the walls, which held markings, names, dates, symbols scratched into the stone. Some were in English, others Latin. At first, the carvings seemed random, but once catalogued, they lined up with records of people believed to have disappeared within the tower centuries earlier. Their names hadn't been erased, just buried. The room held no grand discoveries, no treasure, no scrolls. Yet what it revealed was just as powerful. Proof that stories survive, even when walls are built to hide them. The tower didn't just keep people in, it kept truths out. And with that door opened, silence turned to evidence. It reminded many that what's hidden is not always gone. Sometimes it waits, just behind the stone, for someone to notice. Number 8. In the hills of southern Greece, ruins speak of kings and warriors long gone. Mycenae was once a powerful city, its walls high and its tombs deep. Among those tombs, archaeologists found something strange, a chamber filled with skulls, stacked, not buried. They were placed without ceremony, no grave goods, no spacing, just one on top of the next. The mystery wasn't only about how they got there, it was why they were treated differently. In a city known for its rich burials and royal graves, this site felt forgotten, even unwanted. For years, scholars debated. Some believed the remains belonged to enemies taken during war. Others argued they were victims of disease or disaster, but none of those ideas fully fit the patterns found in the room. Later testing revealed a different story. The skulls shared close genetic ties. These weren't strangers or captives, they were family, possibly from a single extended household, and yet something separated them from the others buried with honor nearby. Clues in the stone, wear on the bones, and damage around the chamber suggested one possibility. These people had been moved, taken from their original graves and placed together in secret, a decision made after their passing, one that erased names but preserved connection. The murmuring came not from voices but from questions. Why were they taken? Who chose to hide them? And what did the act mean? The city above faded, its palaces crumbled, but below, the room endured, and with it, the echo of a choice still not fully understood. Number 7. Beneath Paris lies a second city, one not made of light and architecture, but of stone, shadow, and silence. The catacombs stretch for miles, holding the remains of more than 6 million people. Bones line the walls in patterns, skulls watch without eyes. Visitors see only a portion of it. The rest remains sealed, dark, and often undocumented. In the 1990s, a camcorder was discovered deep inside one of the unauthorized tunnels. The footage it held sparked one of the most unsettling urban mysteries of its time. It showed a man walking alone. His flashlight flickered against the damp walls. He turned corners with no clear plan. His breathing grew faster. Then the footage ended abruptly. The camera was left behind. He was never identified. For years, people speculated. Some claimed he had become lost and never escaped. Others thought the video was part of a staged project. But no one came forward to claim it. The deeper question wasn't whether the footage was real, but why it felt so believable. Later, urban explorers traced the route shown in the tape. They found markers that matched the video, graffiti, broken stones, and turns identical to those seen in the recording. The film wasn't a trick. It captured a real journey. No body was ever found. No official report was linked to the footage, but its accuracy confirmed what many feared. The labyrinth below could swallow someone without a sound, not through force, just confusion and time. The mystery became less about the man and more about the place itself. A reminder that history isn't always buried. Sometimes it wanders in the dark, waiting to be found again. Number 6. Amelia Earhart lifted off in 1937 with the sky wide open and a world watching. Her goal was to fly around the globe, something no woman had done before. But somewhere over the Pacific, her voice faded from the radio. Her plane vanished. No distress call, no confirmed crash, just silence over open water. Search efforts began quickly, but nothing surfaced. For decades, the mystery of her disappearance grew heavier than her legacy. Theories reached in every direction. Some believed she crashed into the ocean. Others thought she landed on an uncharted island. A few even claimed she survived and lived in secret. With no proof, all of them stayed afloat. Then evidence began to surface, not all at once, but piece by piece. Satellite images, island soil tests, a review revealed that many of them lined up with real propagation paths, meaning they were possible, even likely. The signals weren't imagined. They came from somewhere. They came from someone. Though no single answer closed the case, the puzzle finally formed a picture, one of survival, of an coast of Japan. Villagers once spoke of a strange vessel that washed ashore in the early 1800s. It was round, like a saucer, with metal plating and windows made of crystal. Inside, they found symbols no one could read, and a woman dressed in unfamiliar clothes, holding a box she wouldn't let go of. She spoke no known language. Soon after, the tides carried her and the ship away. This event, known as the Tale of the Utsurabune, became one of Japan's most puzzling legends. Historians argued over its meaning. Some believed it was a folk tale built on fear of outsiders. Others thought it could be based on real encounters with foreign travelers or shipwreck survivors. For years it sat between myth and mystery. Then came a closer look, not at the ship, but the context. Scholars examined village records, weather logs, and trade patterns from the period. It turned out that in those years, Japan's borders were tightly controlled. Foreign contact was rare, but not impossible. Several accounts from the era mention unusual craft spotted off the coast, often arriving after storms. One historian found drawings of the ship in multiple locations, each slightly different, but consistent in shape, and the box the woman held, likely an urn or religious item, something deeply personal, not magical. As strange as it all seemed, nothing about the story was impossible. The pieces just didn't belong to one culture. The ship may not have been a fantasy. It could have been real. A vessel lost in the sea, caught in a storm, and remembered by those who saw it as something beyond their world. The mystery was never about whether it happened, but how it was interpreted. What washed ashore was not just wood and metal. It was wonder, floating on water. Number 4. In the hills above Guanajuato, Mexico, Past winding streets and faded stairways, there stands a museum unlike any other. It doesn't display paintings or sculptures. It holds something much older, much more personal. Behind glass, row after row of preserved human remains gaze out with hollow eyes and open mouths. Some are curled, others stand rigid, but most seem to wear the same expression, something between a scream and a plea. Visitors come by the thousands, some out of curiosity, some because they've heard the stories. The mummies of Guanajuato are not the kind embalmed and wrapped like those of ancient Egypt. They were not preserved on purpose. They were discovered by chance and then kept. And what makes them so strange isn't just their appearance. It's the way people speak about them. Locals whisper that some of the mummies moan at night, that faint sounds echo through the halls after closing, that one, in particular, a child with tiny hands pressed against its chest, brings tears to the eyes of those who pass by. The legends vary, but they always return to the same question: why do so many look like they died in fear? The truth begins with the soil. Guanajuato's cemetery rests on ground with an unusual composition, dry, mineral-rich, and low in moisture. These conditions slow the breakdown of organic material. In many cases, they prevent it almost entirely. As a result, those buried here decades ago did not decompose in the expected way. Their bodies dried out, skin shrank, limbs stiffened, clothing clung to bone. That alone wouldn't be enough to fill a museum. But then came the law. In the 19th century, the city introduced a burial tax. Plots were not permanent. Families had to pay regularly to keep their loved ones interred. If the tax went unpaid for several years, the bodies were removed to make space. Many families, unable or unwilling to continue the payments, lost their plots. When workers began exhuming these graves, they were shocked. The remains were intact, not rotted, not collapsed, but preserved. Word spread quickly. Tourists arrived. Some paid to see the bodies. Some offered money to take photographs. Before long, the exhumed remains were put on display, first in storage rooms, then in a dedicated space that grew into the Museo de las Momias. But questions followed. Why were so many faces frozen in what looked like terror? Why were hands clenched, jaws stretched open? Could it be true? Had some of them been buried alive? Medical professionals were asked to examine the mummies. They found no evidence of movement after burial, no broken nails, no torn garments. The poses, however haunting, were explained through natural processes. After passing, the human body does not always relax. As moisture leaves muscles, they contract. This can pull facial features into strange positions. It can lock limbs into place. The result can look like agony, even if none was felt. Still, the rumors never stopped. Some guests claimed they felt watched while inside the museum. Others said the air grew heavy around certain displays. Guards refused to patrol alone after dark, not because of anything they saw, but because of what they felt. One night, a cleaner reported hearing soft tapping from within one of the cases. When she looked, nothing had moved, but the sound stayed with her for years. Not every mummy tells the same story. One of the oldest belonged to a doctor, another to a woman who passed while pregnant. The smallest, and perhaps most haunting, is a child no more than a year old, dressed in white, laid carefully, still holding the blanket he was buried with. These weren't criminals or royalty. They were citizens, people with families and names, once carried through these very streets. For a time, the museum faced criticism. Some argued that displaying the dead in this way was wrong, that it stripped them of dignity, but others said it preserved memory, that these individuals had become more than remains. They had become storytellers, silent witnesses to time, culture, and belief. In response, the museum changed. Glass barriers were added, signs displayed names where known. Information panels explained the process of natural mummification. The mood shifted, not from shock to comfort, but toward understanding. The display was no longer spectacle. It was history, raw and direct. Still, the sound remained. Not real sound, but the imagined noise that rises when the mind is left in silence. The mummies do not moan, they do not speak, but their presence unsettles because they challenge what we think of when we picture the past. We often believe time erases, that dust covers, that memory fades. But the mummies of Guanajuato resist all of that. They remain exactly where they were placed, faces unchanged, posture unbroken, watching as generations pass them by. They aren't frozen in fear, they are frozen in a moment, one we cannot interpret with certainty, and maybe that's why they stay with us, because their silence speaks louder than any scream. Number 3. In the archives of a private collection in northern Italy, far from the museums and cathedrals that draw curious eyes, a portrait lay in shadow. It was not forgotten. It had been moved there on purpose. The canvas was old, held in a frame touched by time and tarnish. It showed a man seated in papal robes, expression still, gaze distant. His face was unfamiliar, not stern, not holy, just still. Unlike other portraits of church officials, this one lacked the usual adornments. There was no golden crest, no inscription to declare a name or title. The only marks were the brushstrokes that brought him to life. That and a reputation that grew louder every year the painting remained hidden. The man who once owned it had passed without much notice, but his journals described strange events tied to the portrait. At night, he said, the hallway grew colder when the painting hung there. His dog barked at the corner of the wall where it was kept. Lamps flickered only near its presence. A close friend of the family later claimed to have collapsed after spending a few minutes alone in the room with it. The medical report blamed exhaustion. Still, they moved the portrait to storage. Years went by, and the painting became a problem no one wanted to solve. No one wanted to destroy it either. That idea was mentioned once during a meeting, then immediately dismissed. Even the archivist laughed it off, but didn't revisit the thought again. When researchers were finally brought in, they didn't search for spirits, they searched for identity. A forensic historian led the team, applying facial recognition software against known images from the Vatican archives. Nothing matched exactly. The man was not listed among the major figures of his time, but the robes he wore weren't imagined. They belonged to a real order. The clothing in the portrait matched that of the Camerlengo, the Chamberlain of the Holy Roman Church, a role that becomes active only when a pope dies. The person in this position temporarily oversees the affairs of the Vatican until a new pope is elected, a figure of immense though brief power. Historical records during the late 1600s mentioned an unnamed cleric who served briefly after a sudden passing. His tenure was marked by silence, no decisions, no public appearances, no decree. His name was never fully recorded in the surviving ledgers. That gap in the archives had long been dismissed as a clerical error, but the timeline fit. One of the more unsettling discoveries came when pigment tests revealed the presence of a rare mercury-based compound used in only a few studios across Italy. This narrowed the list of possible painters to 3 known artists, one of whom specialized in religious commissions. He had been commissioned during the exact window of the unnamed Chamberlain's brief appointment. That meant the man in the portrait might have been memorialized by someone who knew his name, but for reasons lost to history, left it off the work. It wasn't common, but it wasn't unheard of, particularly when politics and church secrecy blended. As more layers were analyzed, other details surfaced. Hidden beneath the thick varnish of the painting was a faint outline. X-ray imaging showed that the original background had once included a small symbol in the upper corner, a closed book with a key across it. That symbol belonged to a secretive inner order tied to archival protection. Their duty wasn't teaching or outreach, it was memory, preserving it, hiding it when needed, and sometimes erasing it. No curse was mentioned in any official Vatican document, but the silence surrounding the portrait's subject made many uneasy. There were no relatives recorded, no burial site, no mention of the man ever stepping down or being replaced, only that he had served and then was no longer there. As for the unease that clung to the painting, several modern explanations emerged. The chemical compounds used in its paint, specifically the mercury and lead traces, could produce mild reactions in some individuals. Dizziness, irritation, even a light feeling of unease when inhaled over time in enclosed rooms. The older buildings that housed it had poor ventilation. That explained the symptoms reported by the former owners. The flickering lights, faulty wiring in the collection wing, humidity caused poor electrical contact in older fixtures. Technicians had documented similar behavior throughout the building, but strangely, none of that reduced the power of the story. Even after the facts were revealed, the painting remained stored behind glass. The staff said it was for preservation, yet none of them asked for it to be displayed again. The man in the portrait remained nameless, not forgotten, but never fully known, and maybe that was the point. Not every mystery waits to be solved. Some are designed to fade, to exist only as a trace, not a memory. What made this portrait unsettling wasn't a haunting, it was what it represented, a person erased, yet preserved, not for honor, not for legacy, just for the simple fact that he had existed. The frame, the paint, the brushwork, none of it was cursed. The weight people felt came from the silence, a silence painted carefully over something history never finished explaining. Number 2. Hidden behind a crumbling brick wall in the heart of Prague's old town, workers uncovered a sealed room. It hadn't been marked on any blueprint. The space was no more than a narrow alcove, just wide enough to hold a table, a chair, and a wooden shelf darkened by age. On that shelf sat a single object wrapped in cloth, covered in layers of dust and wax. What they had found was not treasure, it was a jar. The object appeared ordinary at first, no markings, no label, but when unwrapped, it revealed a dark glass container, oddly shaped and sealed so tightly that even after centuries, nothing had escaped. Inside was a swirling blackish liquid that shimmered when held to the light. Not like oil, not like water, something in between, and it moved with purpose, as if responding to motion around it. Whispers travelled fast. The site was once home to an alchemist, a recluse known only by fragments of his name and reputation. He was said to have worked under the court of Rudolf II, a ruler who invited mystics, mathematicians, and dreamers into his circle. Prague at the time was a city of secrets, a place where science blurred into sorcery. The jar became an object of debate. Some believed it to be a failed elixir. Others said it held the final step of a forgotten process, waiting only for someone brave enough to open it. But most agreed on one thing: whatever was inside had not aged. It had endured. Historians examined nearby texts found on brittle parchment. The notes were written in Latin and a coded shorthand. They described symbols of transformation. Instructions were laid out like riddles: boil the iron heart, draw down the red breath, bind it in glass before the third moon. To some, it read like nonsense. To others, it was a map with pieces missing. Scholars traced the materials used to make the jar. The glass was hand-blown, reinforced with trace amounts of lead and obsidian powder. These techniques weren't widely used in that period, suggesting it was built to last. The stopper itself had a double seal, first wax, then hardened resin. Whoever made it didn't want it to be opened casually. Chemical tests later showed that the liquid inside contained mercury sulfide and small fragments of gold leaf suspended in a thick botanical oil. It was similar to mixtures used in ancient tinctures, but the proportions were off, too precise for medicine, too balanced for paint. The idea of immortality surrounded the object, but this wasn't a cure. It was never meant for the body. It was part of a ritual, meant to capture something abstract. The notes hinted at preservation of thought. One scholar believed it represented the philosopher's mind made manifest, sealed as a symbol, a final experiment not of flesh, but of will. When the artifact was placed in a climate-controlled vault, reports began to surface among staff. A technician said the room felt colder when the jar was present. Another claimed the liquid responded to light, glowing faintly under certain conditions. Sensors picked up slight electromagnetic interference, but nothing dangerous. Still, the object made people uneasy, not because it moved, but because it never did. It sat perfectly still even when shaken. The liquid didn't slosh. It shifted with intention, as if resisting. That resistance couldn't be explained with science, and that's where fascination took hold. Philosophers weighed in. Some believed the jar reflected the heart of the alchemist himself, sealed away not to be used but to be remembered. A message, a boundary, proof that something had been attempted, even if it failed. In one later interpretation, a theologian pointed out that the seal bore 7 small notches, evenly spaced. These notches aligned with alchemical signs for lead, tin, iron, copper, mercury, silver, and gold, the 7 classical metals tied to the 7 celestial bodies known at the time. This wasn't a mistake, it was a key, but no one knew what it opened. That raised another possibility. Perhaps the jar was never meant to be opened at all. Maybe its purpose was containment, not of magic, but of history, a moment caught and crystallized, the final thought of someone who had given everything to a pursuit no one else could understand. Over the years, many replicas of the jar were made. Artists tried to capture its darkness. Museums displayed copies in shadow boxes, but none of them carried the weight of the original. Something about the true jar defied replication. It wasn't the shape, it wasn't the color, it was the feeling. Even now, the object remains sealed, not because of fear, but because of respect. Every test brings more information, but never enough to fully explain its purpose. And that may be the most important truth it offers. In a world that often rushes to uncover every answer, the alchemist's jar reminds us that some mysteries were never meant to be solved. They were meant to be held, gently, carefully, as symbols of the questions that shaped us. What the alchemist placed in that jar may never be revealed, and yet by leaving it behind, he gave us something greater than gold. He gave us wonder. Number 1. In 1587, over 100 settlers stepped onto Roanoke Island, carrying hope, tools, and the fragile idea of permanence. They had crossed an ocean with the dream of building something lasting. They laid stones, raised timber, and wrote letters to the world they had left behind. But when ships returned 3 years later, the colony had vanished. There were no bodies, no signs of battle, no structures still standing, only a post with the word Croatoan carved into it. That was all. The disappearance of the Roanoke colony quickly became one of the first and greatest unsolved events in early American history. It left behind more questions than clues. Families were gone without a trace. The buildings were taken down, not destroyed. It was as if the settlers had packed up and walked into the trees. But no one could say why or where they had gone. For centuries, this mystery was wrapped in myth. Writers imagined violence. They pictured desperate settlers lost to starvation, attacked by outsiders, or buried beneath storms. Some even claimed that the last days of Roanoke were filled with strange cries in the woods, with settlers hearing screams that were not entirely human. These tales shaped the legend, but not the truth. The silence that followed allowed imagination to grow, and in that silence, people saw ghosts. But history waits for those willing to look beyond legend. In recent decades, archaeologists and historians began piecing together a different story. One not of fear, but of survival. On Hatteras Island, south of Roanoke, they uncovered pottery fragments, metal tools, and signs of English craftsmanship buried among the remains of indigenous homes. These artifacts matched those known to be used by the colonists. The dating was right, the designs were identical, the material came from the same sources. These weren't gifts, they weren't trade goods, they were brought and used. This evidence strongly suggested that at least some of the settlers had moved, not as captives, not as a broken group, but as people trying to begin again. The word Croatoan carved into the post wasn't a mystery, it was a direction. It was the name of the nearby island, home to the Croatan people, a community known to have friendly ties with the English. When supplies failed and leadership collapsed, the settlers likely made a choice. They left Roanoke and sought shelter among those who welcomed them. It wasn't abandonment, it was adaptation. Genetic studies offered further support. Several indigenous families in the region, especially among the Lumbee people of North Carolina, carry oral histories of mixed ancestry. Some of their words, customs, and family lines reflect European influence long before major settlements arrived. The connection isn't folklore, it's lived memory. What about the screams, the strange echoes said to fill the trees after the colony vanished? Most likely, those were stories told later, warnings born from uncertainty. When people disappear without explanation, the mind fills the silence with what it fears most, and the woods have always been easy to blame. But from the perspective of the settlers, the move to Croatoan may have been an act of hope, an attempt to survive in a land that gave them no guarantees. Without regular supplies, without clear leadership, they made the choice not to wait, but to walk. They weren't the only ones. Other early colonies struggled in similar ways. Some were lost, some absorbed. The difference with Roanoke is that it left behind so little. No diary, no records, just one word on a beam and 100 names never written in stone. The mystery lingered not because it was unsolvable, but because it was human. It lacked drama. It lacked spectacle. The truth didn't roar, it whispered. Today, historians believe that the disappearance of the Roanoke colony was less of a vanishing and more of a merging, a quiet decision made by people who saw no other path forward. They disappeared from the maps, but not from the land. The silence that surrounded them wasn't evidence of tragedy, it was evidence of transition, of a new chapter written without ink or flag. There were no screams beneath Roanoke, only footsteps fading into the forest, where life, changed and unfamiliar, still waited. Thank you so much for watching this video. Don't forget to click the subscribe button